Have you heard of this book? It's called The Art of Comic Book Inking by Gary Martin and Steve Rude. I've talked about this book a long time ago on my channel, a couple times I think. And if you're on the market for a book, a how-to sort of drawing book that focuses specifically on inking, comic book inking, this is the book. This is one of my favorite sort of instructional books. There's not too many really good ones out there, and every time I talk about instructional art books, I always include this in my list. It's a very comprehensive and practical guide to comic book inking, and it's not only told or instructed by just Gary Martin and Steve Rude, but there's a whole bunch of other inkers that are featured in here, and you get to see their process and approach on a specific penciled drawing, and you kind of get to see how each inker goes about it differently. And then in the back of the book, there is examples provided by Steve Rude as well as some other pencilers where all the various inkers in this book that are featured sort of take a crack at the same penciled drawing. So for this video, I wanted to focus on one of the penciled pages that is featured in this book. It's one by Steve Rude, and it's inked by several inking greats. Guys who definitely know what they're doing when it comes to inking comics. And it's really cool to see how each one of them ink Steve Rude's pencils very differently. And so if you're interested in learning how to ink or what inking comics even is, this is definitely going to be the video for you. I'm going to go in depth into each inker's approach with inking this particular penciled page, talking about some of the instruction that they provided, as well as my own personal analysis of it. So this video is for someone who has the time to watch it and is really interested in becoming a better inker, whether you want to ink someone else's work or you want to ink your own work. I often get a lot of questions on this channel and other platforms about inking. So I know it's something that is sort of on the top of mind of a lot of you out there. And for good reason too. Inking is really the cherry on top for good comic book art. And it's also one of the harder things to do within the comic book making process. Some of you OG comic book makers out there might own a copy of this book, but this came out maybe almost 20 years ago. So it's been a while, and I don't think it's as readily available. I'll leave a link in the description below if I could find one where you can pick this up, hopefully for an affordable price. If you can't get your hands on a copy of this book, I do want to mention that since Steve Rude is one of the co-authors of this book, he actually has a new drawing book coming out pretty soon. I mentioned it a while ago on the channel when he was running the Kickstarter for it, but the book is fully funded and it should be coming out soon. I think this month, actually. I'm really looking forward to getting my copy. I've talked on this channel before about one of his other books, How to Draw the Animated Nexus. So between that book and this book, he definitely has a really great track record for making practical and super helpful instructional books. So I'll also leave a link in the description where you might be able to pick up that book. Anyway, like I said, this video is going to be a little bit in-depth and involved. I hope you get a lot out of it. So I want to stop talking and just jump right into it. I hope you dig it. So here are the Steve Rude pencils. These are more like layouts than finished pencils, and I think the intention with this example was probably to keep the pencils very open and I guess open to interpretation. Steve Rude's pencils here aren't spoon feeding the inker. It's leaving it up to that inker's imagination and sensibilities to sort of just enhance and add to this piece. But at the same time, if you're familiar with Steve Rude's work, this is very obviously Steve Rude. It has all the charms and greatness that anyone who is a fan of Steve Rude's would love and recognize. So for any of the inkers who are going to be inking this, I think the point is to maintain Steve Rude's essence and style while also enhancing it and finishing it. As I've mentioned on this channel and other videos before, oftentimes back in the day, inkers were credited as finishers. because pencils back then sometimes were very much more open, more like layouts, breakdowns than they were these very detailed finished pencils that sort of came later on. So anyway, I say all of that to say that these are actually perfect pencils in terms of having other artists ink on top of it, because it's just open enough and descriptive enough for the inker to kind of see what's happening and know what's going on. But then there's just also so much room for them to play with and on top of. So let's take a look and see how these inkers right here interpreted this piece of Steve Rude art. I'm probably going to be zooming in and out because I want to show you specific panels and give you real details. And I'm probably also going to be flipping back and forth quite a bit, just because when I'm looking at examples like this myself in books like this, I'm always going back and forth just to compare the inked version to the penciled version and just see where there's differences, where there's enhancements, and just to see how the piece improved or changed in any way. So bear with me. I'll try to make it as visually pleasing as I can. So here is Brian Bolland's interpretation. This is the first example here. I'm going to zoom in just to give you a nice look at Brian Bolland's beautiful inks here. Really, I think he did a wonderful job inking this piece. Let's just take this bottom tier here just so we can focus in. You can get a good glimpse of that. And let me just remind you of what those pencil layouts looked like from Steve Rude. And then you could compare and see how the inks kind of changed the piece, enhanced it, but also I think maintained the integrity of Steve Rude's pencils and artwork here. We'll look at the top tier here now too. Just look at the, for instance, the tree bark here and this whole panel and how he really took so many liberties, but again, didn't change it in a way that made it look unrecognizable to Steve Rude's audience. This still looks very, very Steve Rude, but look at how much he brought that thing to life. Shadows, textures, really brought the nature and the birds to life. Some noteworthy stuff about Brian Bolland's techniques and supplies is that he uses a Winsor Newton Series 16 number 3 sable brush, which I'm not familiar with. I'm familiar with the Series 7, but a Series 16 I've never heard of. Let me know in the comments below if that's something that you're familiar with. But he also mentions that aside from the panel borders, which he used a rapidograph for, everything else was inked with the brush. I find that interesting because when I look at Brian Bolland's work, there's such precision and sort of fine lines to it that I would think that he uses quite a bit of pen actually, but he says here that he barely ever uses a pen. He never really got the hang of it. So he uses a brush for just about everything, which to me is surprising looking at his style. The other noteworthy thing here in terms of his process is that he actually re-penciled it. So he light boxed on top of Steve Rude's pencils here. I'm assuming they all got like a printout of his pencils. And then he re-penciled it again onto a fresh sheet of Bristol board paper rather than inking either on top of the layout itself or just inking it directly on top of the light box. So that's interesting that he actually went out of his way to re-pencil the whole thing. Brian Bolland's work and technique has a very sort of thorough feel to it. It seems very meticulous and kind of labored over. I think that comes across in his work in a good way, not a bad way. It's very precise and very exact. Every line feels like it was meant to be there. So it doesn't surprise me in a way that he would go to the lengths to re-pencil on top of Steve Rude's pencils. And then what he also said was that in the process, he actually made some adjustments. One of the things that an inker's job is to do, which Brian Bolland mentions in his little blurb here, is that you want to maintain the integrity of the penciler, like I mentioned earlier. You don't want to sort of like impose your own style too much onto the pencils, although some inkers do. We'll actually see some examples of that as we go on in this chapter here. But Generally speaking, you kind of want to be that like invisible hand on top of the penciler's work and doing everything you can to just sort of like enhance the work. And so one of the things he did in order to make like subtle enhancements to the work was that I found it interesting in this first panel, he did two things where one, this background character here, I'll show you the before and after here in the pencils. He found that her arm right here, I guess that's her right arm, is just a little too short. So he just moved the full figure over a little bit to the right, just so that he could extend that left arm. And if you could see there, it's such a subtle change and such a subtle difference, but it makes a really great impact. That's something that before I even read his description, I didn't even realize that he made that adjustment. But looking back at it, you can see where it really does, enhance the piece very subtly but effectively. And then there's some other smaller changes, like Sundra's back leg over here. He just lifted it slightly. You could see the difference. There's the pencil. And then he just moved it just a little bit further. So she's stepping out just a little bit further. Again, real subtle. I don't think anyone would really notice, but it certainly doesn't do it any harm. And if anything, it does improve it. He added a little bit more, I guess, anatomy and, detail to like her foot and her leg as well. And then, of course, the most obvious thing, which it seems like a lot of the other inkers who inked on top of this piece, we'll see very shortly, also did versions of this where they spotted blacks in a way that really sort of grounds the image onto the page. Like I said here, these are more like layout breakdown pencils. So there's really no indication of shadows, darks, and lights. This is much more like a coloring book. And so it's open to interpretation, and it's really interesting to see how every inker kind of grounds the piece differently using solid blacks and black spotting. And just looking at the difference between the two, I think, if nothing else, just shows you how much spotting blacks can really improve upon pencils. There's also definitely a sense of design that goes into it too. Compositionally, kind of brings your eye, leads your eye across the page in a way that hopefully is pleasing. And I think Brian Bolland does that really well here. So he spots blacks in these last two panels, I think, really interestingly, if you see before and after. Also, what he did was he added a horizon line to the background here. Again, a really subtle change that I didn't even realize until I read that part of his description. Okay, so the next inker is Rudy Nebres. I'm not sure I'm familiar with Rudy's work. I'm sure I've seen it before. I don't know if he is just strictly an inker or a penciler inker, but let me know in the comments down below if you know anything about Rudy's work. But one of the beautiful things about inking is that there are no two exact ways of inking. And I think just looking at Brian Bolland's approach and then seeing Rudy's approach here, it's just proof of that. Look at how different Brian Bolland is to Rudy's interpretation here. And this is just a broader view. You could already see just from like a zoomed out perspective that these are two very different approaches. But I'll zoom in a little bit further so that we can take a look specifically at how he changed those pencils and brought them to life with ink. So here are Steve Rude's pencils for that top tier, and then here is Rudy's. And then let's take a look at that bottom tier here and see how he interpreted those. He doesn't write much about his process in this example here, but he does say that the first thing he does is outline the pencils with a good thin pen, usually a Pentel fountain pen. And then after that, he goes in with a Winsor Newton Series 7, sort of like a very classic traditional comic book inking brush. And he does all the rendering, special effects, and black spotting. So in terms of the openness of the backgrounds that Steve Rude left here in his pencils, I think Rudy was very loyal to that. He kind of stayed pretty true to those pencils, leaving it very, very open. But he did add quite a bit of texture in other areas and black spotting as well. Most notably, we could see here how he interpreted that foreground tree bark there. Really, really beautifully done. I love the pen lines that he's getting from there. I would only assume those are pen, although those might be brush, because he did say that he did all the textures and black spotting with the brush. So it's just interesting to see how each inker interprets that element right there. I feel like that's the part that every inker is really able to leave their mark on. You could see too that he took a lot of liberties here in terms of Sundra's face, which was left very, very open in terms of any kind of lighting or texture. And he kind of took some liberties in terms of adding texture to the hair and some cast shadows and lighting on her face, as well as that background figure too. We could see all the difference there. We're only two examples in right now. There's a few more to go, and so we'll see how, again, there is no one way of inking the same piece of penciled art. Every inker is going to leave their own sort of like temperament and personality on top of the penciler's work. Kevin Nowlan. Kevin Nowlan is a inker and a penciler. Like anyone that Kevin Nowlan inks, it's interesting to see where the penciler leaves off and Kevin Nowlan sort of takes over. It's much more of a collaboration than like a traditional penciler inker dynamic. I would say certainly this foreground character's face here, the way it's lit and the way the blacks are spotted, is very, very Kevin Nowlan. And again, let's just compare with Steve Rude's original pencils there. Again, very, very open to interpretation. And he really brought that whole sort of composition to life just by rounding out that background area with a nice black kind of lighting effect. And then if we could compare his tree bark to not only Steve Rude's original tree bark, but let's go back and compare it so far to everyone else. This is kind of like the benchmark here for this whole exercise, is that tree bark. So here's Kevin Nowlan. Here is Rudy Nebres, if I'm saying that right, Nebres. And then here is Brian Bolland. So you could see three different interpretations, and they all couldn't be more dissimilar. And I think that's the best part about the whole thing. And then let's take a little closer look at the bottom tier here. Let's compare it to Steve Rude's pencils. And then here we go with Kevin Nowlan's inks. Feel free to pause the video too, just so that you can, if you don't have this book, you can kind of compare and contrast the two different versions. But yeah, it's also really interesting to see how each inker approached that background. These are very wild kind of backgrounds here that Steve Rude is showing on this page. And it's really interesting to see how a good inker like Kevin Nowlan goes in and is able to like decipher certain things while also adding so much to it, like lighting. He uses some like what it seems to be like cast shadows here from other branches and trees on the back there. That's really, really nicely done. And then he just kind of cleans up some areas too, so that things are just a little bit more delineated and it feels like an actual background in true perspective with, you know, characters like inside of it. So as far as tools, this is everything that Kevin Nowlan used. He used a Hunt 102 Crow Quill, a Raphael or Winsor Newton Sable Brush, number 3 or 4. He used some Rapidograph pens, a number 0, a number 1, and a number 4. He used Pelican or Higgins Black Magic ink, which is actually surprising. I think of his work as very rich and black, and Higgins Black Magic ink, at least my experience of it, has always been a little bit watery. And then he used some Pro White paint for corrections. So if you were ever wondering what Kevin Nowlan uses to ink, that's it right there. So he says that he inked all of the line work with a Hunt 102 Crow Quill pen, which is sort of like a classic comic book inking pen. And then all the long curved stems in the background here, as well as the picnic basket. He says he inked that with a rapidograph and French curves. So you can see the precision there. That's one of the things that an inker's job is to do, is to kind of like clean up some of these more like inanimate objects. And like the tree branch, it's kind of interesting to also note how little things like the picnic basket and then this little jar over here that's in the foreground of both these bottom panels is interpreted by each inker. Because as you can see here in the pencils, it's drawn, all the information is there, but it's certainly not precise. And the job of an inker, whether you're inking your own work or you're inking anyone else, is to kind of like clean up some of those curved lines and make it feel a little less sketchy and a little bit more, real and in perspective. Similar with the picnic basket and all that kind of stuff. Those are kind of like those thankless jobs that an inker has to do, but they go a long way in terms of bringing little elements like that to life, whether it's inanimate objects, background objects, whatever it might be. Those are the things that really can't be overlooked. As much as I guess they could be sketched in pencil, they need to be much more precisely done with inking. Okay, the next example is Jerry Ordway, someone who has been in the business for a very long time, a comic book veteran. This is definitely an expert, an inker and a penciler throughout his career, and having that artistic eye, the eye that understands or could get inside of the head of a penciler because they are a penciler themselves. That's really, really helpful when you're, approaching this stuff, another artist's pencils. I think you're better able to fill in some of those blanks and also use some of your own expertise in terms of drawing to enhance and improve upon the art wherever you can. And one of the first things I'm noticing about this interpretation is the black spotting too. He did a really, really good job in terms of how the blacks are spotted and how they kind of help lead your eye across the page and from panel to panel. Really, really well done. He actually says here that, he says, my favorite technique for deciding where black areas need to be spotted is to squint at the page from an arm's length. If nothing pops out at me, I start in on the piece with a Grumbacher No. 4 Sable Essence brush, which I've never heard of, loaded with Pelikan drawing ink. So before he even starts, he just looks at the pencil, if we could go back, from an arm's length, kind of steps back a little bit, squints his eye, and sees where black areas can be spotted, where it would help ground the image and where it would help the overall design of the page, leading the eye from panel to panel. And then that's when he goes in and decides where those black areas are going to be. And if you kind of look at Steve's interpretation here, and then Jerry Ordway's interpretation here, like I said, the first thing that I really do notice is that really wonderful black spotting. It's not imposing either. It doesn't completely change the pencils. It just enhances it and fills in some of those gaps and really grounds the figures in that environment. And then of course we'll take a look at how he handled that tree bark. A little bit less texture than some of the others and more solid blacks. All different approaches. Love to see it. I also really like the way he handled Sundra's face here. He just slightly elaborated upon Steve Rude's pencils here. I think he's very, very loyal to it, but he brings it to life again with just some subtle extra lines, a little bit of extra spotted blacks. He's adding a few more lines to the face to indicate cheekbones, some subtle shadows by the eyes, under the nose there, bringing the hair to life with some really nice brushy lines back there. I think that's very, very loyal to a penciler's pencils, while also just kind of like not only getting it print ready, but taking it to that next level. Okay, next up is Steve Rude himself. So this will be really interesting to kind of take a look and see how he inks his own work and how it compares to some of the other artists who, you know, took a crack at his pencils. So let's just get into it. Let's see that first tier right here. So it's interesting to see how he spots the blacks too. Maybe a little bit more along the lines of Jerry Ordway's approach too. You can see they're kind of almost spotting blacks similarly. Let's take a look at how just that first tier compares to some of the other ones we looked at so far. There's Kevin Nowlan, there's Steve Rude, there's Rudy Nebres, there's Steve Rude, there's Brian Bolland. So yeah, really interesting to see how it's a little bit more of a graphic approach. The blacks are black, the whites are white. He's not really using too many mid-tones. It says here that what he did with this page was that he inked it on a sheet of vellum over his pencils, and he spray mounted that sheet of vellum on top of the pencils and then inked on top of that, which is an interesting approach. And he used a Cosmos brush number 4 for 95% of the work. I'm not familiar with a Cosmos brush either. Let me know in the comments below if you've ever heard of those or used them before. But it seems like they get a really nice effect on his work, and just a sort of wide shot here to see how Steve Rude's own inks compare to his own pencils. There we go. Okay, so now this is going to be a real treat because on this channel I have talked about separately Steve Rude's work as well as Mark Schultz's work, and it seems as though the viewership, you guys, really like both of these artists, as do I. And so to see Mark Schultz inking on top of Steve Rude seems to be sort of like a dream come true for my channel here. It's putting two incredible artists together, two artists that are both strong comic artists as well as illustrators, and seeing them together on the same piece is really, really cool, and a very, very interesting, I think, unique approach that Mark Schultz took to inking this Steve Rude page. There's so much to sort of take in here, so I'm gonna look at it from like a broader view right now, and then we'll start to zoom in a little bit. But let's just take in the whole page here, just because I think that the spotting of the blacks and the way the contrast of the stark black, stark white, and then some of what I'm thinking is probably zipatone in some of these areas here, and how all of that just plays so nicely together on the page. I would say Mark Schultz here is just taking this all the way to a 10 right here. And so let's just see how Steve Rude's pencils started here, and then how Mark Schultz kind of interpreted it. So that tree bark that we keep talking about, look at how he decided to interpret that. That's probably 98% blacked out silhouette. And this is what he was originally working with. Boy, it takes a lot of courage to be able to completely black that out and know how to handle it. And when you see it done, it's a very nice design element. But to think to do that, just by looking at that original penciled page, that's a really, really strong eye that certainly Mark Schultz definitely has. He's also using some zipatone here, which I'm assuming is what that is. And he's using it very sparingly in really nice ways. I like the way he just kind of uses it to add a little bit of texture to those birds in the foreground there. That's really, really nice. And then perhaps my favorite is the way that he just kind of like completely blacks out this last panel here, using so much black and taking the bold move that I think oftentimes is the right move by just letting black fade into black instead of adding some sort of halo or white outline. I think sometimes that could look nice depending on the artist and depending on the style, but it's always such a bold move that I think goes such a long way when, you know, black just bleeds into black. And if the figure work and the drawing is strong, then that approach oftentimes will work really, really nicely. It's just, sometimes it's the scarier thing to do because you're just adding so much black to that particular composition, but I think it works really, really well here. So let's see how that really, really open Steve Rude penciling kind of looks compared to how Mark Schultz interpreted it there. Mark Schultz is obviously also no stranger to drawing, the female figure, and I think he does that really well on top of Steve Rude's pencils here. He indicates on the next page that he pretty much uses a Winsor Newton Series 7 number 2 brush. So he's just using sort of like the classic comic book inking brush, especially from, back in the day. It's a little bit different now, but that's all he's using here. And it's just interesting to see how the same tools can look differently depending on whose hand it's attached to. It just goes to show that so much of the artist's intangible qualities, your personality, your temperament, your patience, whatever it might be, it all shows through in the final art, and it could change art dramatically. Some of that has to do with the supplies that you're using, but ultimately, I think that it's all the other things that are going to contribute to making your work look great and your work look like you. At the end of the day, so far, these inkers that we looked at, they're all presumably inking this on paper. I think Steve Rude inked it on some vellum paper, but it's paper nonetheless. They're using ink. They're using either brushes and pens and a combination of the two. And they're all getting like very, very different results and approaching it in a different way just because they're all, individual people, and they're bringing their own sensibilities and experience to this particular image. And that's the really cool thing to kind of get out of this, is that there is no one right, correct way of doing it when it comes to inking. Skill and precision and practice is going to help, certainly, with all of that stuff. But as time goes on, you're going to realize that it's going to be your own eye and your own intuition that's really going to lead the way. So from Mark Schultz to Dave Stevens, Mark Schultz, Steve Rude, Dave Stevens, they all kind of come from a very similar era, a similar set of influences. And to see the combination of someone like Mark Schultz and Steve Rude, as well as now Dave Stevens and Steve Rude, is really, really something to see those two powerhouses kind of come together on a piece. Of course, Dave Stevens, the late, great artist who created The Rocketeer, has also such a really beautiful, illustrative, black and white approach to making comics and illustration. He also has a very precise way of inking, similar to a Brian Bolland and a Mark Schultz. Each line looks very, very intentional and thought out. There's nothing there that seems like it shouldn't be there. And it's interesting to see how he chooses to spot blacks within this page as well. I just like the way that, for me, this kind of stream that's rolling across these two panels, the way he spots the blacks here, it makes it feel like it's one continuous background in a way that it's not like a mistaken tangent or anything like that. It almost feels like it's intentional, and it kind of creates that sense of movement and rhythm from this panel to that panel. I think that's really, really nice. Unfortunately, he didn't mention what tools he's using in the description, but I would guess to say that this is mostly brush, and there's probably some pen lines here and there on some of the smaller details, maybe on these birds over here, some of these other background details. But yeah, really, really smooth brush inking. He really enhances the anatomy, especially in this third panel here. You can see where he captures the gesture of Steve Rude's pencils really, really well, while kind of making it a little bit tighter and more three-dimensional in certain areas, as compared to Steve Rude's more gestural pencils. And then, of course, let's take a look and see how he kind of navigated that foreground tree bark area. It kind of feels much more loyal to Steve Rude's pencils here, perhaps the most loyal, I would say, of any of the inkers that we looked at. So that's really, really interesting to see. Just so clean, though. This is a difficult panel to ink because it's a tricky angle and perspective
to kind of capture the figures like that. And then also there's so much happening in the foreground. And so there's several elements happening. There's a tricky perspective, there's smaller figures, there's a lot of challenges for an inker in this particular panel. And I think all of them just nailed it really, really well. But Dave Stevens, I think, organizes all those elements visually really, really nicely so that it's not overwhelming. Let's take a wider look here and just see how the full pages compare to one another. There's the original pencils, and then there's Dave Stevens' interpretation on there. Seems kind of like a no-brainer to have these two work together. Their styles and their approaches really, really complement each other beautifully.
All right, The Art of Comic Book Inking by Gary Martin with Steve Rude. What did you think? That was pretty awesome to see all those different interpretations of Steve Rude's pencils. One of the best ways to learn is just by watching other people do something. And this is a really great way to watch and learn from a variety of different inkers and their various approaches. So feel free to go back into this video and kind of like pause certain moments in there if you want to just compare and see how each inker inked different panels in their own individual way. And perhaps there's an inker within this video that resonates closely with your style and can give you maybe some better insight into how you can get the most out of that style. Or maybe there's an inker that approaches it completely different than you do and you really like it and you want to kind of incorporate that approach. So hopefully I was able to kind of like show you in video form a little bit of what this book has to offer. There are other examples in this book, not only by Steve Rude, but by other pencilers as well. So if you want to see more videos like this where we dissect a different penciled page and how other inkers approach that particular page, let me know in the comments below. I would love to do more videos like this. Perhaps this could be like a whole video series or something like that. Also, speaking of how-to stuff, on my Patreon currently, I have a video series called How I Make an Illustration. So if you want to see how I go about inking some of my own stuff, how I go about composing an illustration, collecting inspiration, I sort of go a little bit more in depth than some of my more shorter process videos. Like I said, it's a 5-part video series, and I try to highlight and show you all the different parts of the process along through those 5 parts. So if you're interested in checking out that video series, like I said, it's on my Patreon. You could sign up for the Patreon. I'd love to have you there. I share a bunch of other really cool stuff over there. But if you're not interested in signing up month to month, you can also just buy that course outright if you want to as well. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can either sign up for my Patreon or just buy the 5-part video series if you're interested. All right, well, that's it. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you dig it. If you have any questions or comments, anything you'd like to add, please do leave that in the comments. I look forward to checking out your comments and what you thought of this video. That's all I got for now. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.